My name is Claire Morgan and I'm 38 years old. I used to think the worst thing a mother could do was choose favorites. I was wrong. The worst thing is watching your own mother look at two innocent boys and decide that one deserves a future more than the other. It happened on a Sunday night over roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and a table my father had built with his own hands. My mother put down her fork, looked directly at my two sons and said, "Keep the smart one. The other is a burden." Nobody moved. My younger son, Ethan, was still holding his spoon. My older son, Mason, was staring at his plate. And then Mason quietly asked me the question that I still hear in my head at 3 in the morning. "Mom, which one does she want you to keep?" I wish I could tell you I handled it perfectly. I didn't. I stood there with my hands pressed against the edge of the table, trying to understand how the woman who had once braided my hair before school could say something so cruel about my child. My mother, Diane, didn't apologize. She simply picked up her water glass and acted as if she had commented on the weather. My father stared at his napkin. My younger sister, Melissa, suddenly became fascinated by her phone. And Mason, my 14-year-old, did what he had learned to do whenever adults made him uncomfortable. He disappeared into himself. That was the part that scared me. Mason had always been the quiet one. Not shy. Not weak. Quiet. There was a difference. He noticed everything. He remembered conversations from years ago. He could tell when someone was angry by the way they closed a cabinet. He could walk into a room and know within seconds whether he was welcome. Ethan was different. At 11, he was loud, funny, endlessly curious, and the kind of kid who could make a cashier laugh before we reached the register. Teachers loved him. My mother adored him. Mason had never been her favorite. For years, I told myself it was harmless. Every family has personalities that fit together better than others. Diane called Ethan my little genius because he was good at math. She bought him science kits, took him for ice cream, and bragged about his grades to anyone who would listen. When Mason won a regional writing competition in 7th grade, she said, "That's nice," and immediately asked Ethan how his baseball season was going. Mason noticed more. But I never imagined she would eventually try to make that difference permanent. The strange thing is, the warning signs had started months before that dinner. It began with small questions. My mother started asking me things like, "Are you sure Mason is keeping up at school?" Then, "Does he have friends?" Then, "Have you ever considered that maybe he needs more help than Ethan?" I answered every question. Mason was doing well. His grades weren't perfect, but they were good. He loved drawing, history, and old movies. He had recently started working on a graphic novel in a notebook he kept locked in his desk. But Diane wasn't interested in those answers. She wanted a different answer. She wanted me to admit there was something wrong with my oldest son. I didn't know why until one afternoon when I came home early from work and found my mother sitting at my kitchen table with Mason's school file open in front of her. She looked up too quickly. I froze in the doorway. "What are you doing with that?" Diane closed the folder. "I'm your mother," she said. "I'm trying to help." "Help with what?" She smiled, but it wasn't the warm smile I knew. "Claire, you're raising 2 boys alone. You have to start thinking realistically." I remember those words because she said them like she had already made a decision for me. "What does that mean?" She leaned closer. "It means one of your boys has a much brighter future than the other." I felt something cold move through my chest. Before I could answer, she picked up her purse and walked toward the door. But she stopped beside me. "Just don't make the mistake of letting one child hold the other one back." Then she left. That night, I checked on my sons before bed. Ethan was asleep, sprawled across his blanket, one sock missing. Mason was awake. He was sitting at his desk with his notebook open. He didn't look at me. "Mom." "Yeah. Grandma doesn't like me, does she?" I wanted to lie. Instead, I walked over, sat beside him, and put my hand over his. "She loves you." Mason finally looked at me. "No, Mom. She loves Ethan." I didn't have an answer. And what I didn't know was that Mason had already started keeping something in that locked desk drawer. something he had been collecting for weeks. Something that would eventually prove my mother hadn't simply been cruel at dinner. She had been preparing for something. And 3 weeks later I would discover exactly what. 3 days after that dinner, my mother called me before I had even finished my first cup of coffee. "Claire, we need to talk." Her voice was calm. "Come. About what?" "About the boys." Closed my eyes. "I'm not having this conversation again. You're being emotional." "No. I'm being their mother." There was a pause. Then she said something that made my stomach tighten. "I spoke to someone who knows about these things." "What things?" "Teenage boys who struggle socially. Boys who don't fit into normal family routines." I stared at the kitchen window. "Mason does not need to be fixed." "I never said fixed." "You implied it." "Claire, listen to me. Ethan is thriving. Mason is complicated. You can't pretend you don't see the difference." Hung up. For the first time in my life, I was angry enough that my hands actually shook. But anger wasn't the dangerous part. The dangerous part was that my mother had started talking to other people. And I had no idea who. That afternoon I picked the boys up from school. Ethan ran toward the car, talking about a science project. Mason walked behind him with his backpack hanging from one shoulder. As soon as he got into the car, he asked, "Did Grandma call?" I looked at him through the mirror. "Why?" He shrugged. "She asked me something yesterday." My heart skipped. "What did she ask?" Mason stared out the window. "She asked if I would rather live somewhere else." The car suddenly felt too small. "What exactly did she say?" "She said sometimes people are happier when they stop pretending they belong somewhere." I gripped the steering wheel. "Did she say anything else?" Mason shook his head. Then Ethan leaned forward from the back seat. "She told me I could stay with her whenever I wanted." Silence. I looked at Ethan. "Did she say that to you?" He nodded. "She said I could have my own room." That night I called my mother. She answered on the second ring. "You talked to Mason?" "Of course I did. He's my grandson." "You asked him if he wanted to live somewhere else?" "I asked him a question." "And you told Ethan he could stay with you?" "He likes being here." "He's 11. So he doesn't get to choose which brother gets removed from the family." Diane laughed softly. "You always make everything dramatic." "No. You keep making everything cruel." The line went quiet. Then her voice changed. "Claire, you have 2 sons, but you don't have 2 identical futures." That sentence stayed with me. Because I realized she wasn't trying to convince me anymore. She was trying to make me doubt myself. The following week, things became stranger. Mason's school counselor called me. She said someone had contacted the school asking questions about Mason's academic performance and emotional adjustment. "Who?" She hesitated. "A family member." My stomach dropped. "Who?" She wouldn't give me a name over the phone. I drove to the school that afternoon. The counselor showed me a copy of an email. It was from my mother. She had written that she was concerned about the long-term stability of Mason's home environment, and wanted to know whether professionals had observed behavioral or developmental concerns. I read it twice. There was nothing technically false in the email. That was what made it dangerous. She wasn't inventing a scandal. She was creating a question. And questions, I was beginning to understand, could be more powerful than lies. When I got home, Mason was sitting on the front steps. He looked up. "Mom." "Yeah. Am I going somewhere?" I sat beside him. "No. Grandma keeps telling me I might." I put my arm around his shoulders. "You're not going anywhere." He was quiet for a moment. Then he whispered. "She said if I leave, Ethan gets everything." My blood went cold. "Everything?" He nodded. "Your house. Your attention. Your money. She said Ethan shouldn't have to lose his future because I'm difficult." I couldn't speak. Mason reached into his backpack. For a second I thought he was going to pull out a school book. Instead he took out his phone. "I didn't know if you'd believe me." He opened a folder. There were screenshots, messages, voice recordings. Photographs of handwritten notes. I stared at the screen. Mason, how long have you been saving these? He looked down. Since Grandma first started asking me questions. Why didn't you tell me? His eyes filled with tears. Because every time I told an adult something before, they said I was causing problems. That sentence broke something inside me. I pulled him against my chest. You should never have had to collect proof to be believed. He didn't answer. But before I could ask what else was on that phone, a car pulled into our driveway. My mother stepped out. She wasn't carrying a cake. She wasn't smiling. And she wasn't alone. A woman I had never seen before got out of the passenger seat, holding a thick folder against her chest. My mother looked directly at me. Claire, she said, we need to talk about what's best for the boys. I looked at the folder, then at Mason, and for the first time I understood something terrifying. My mother hadn't been trying to win an argument. She had been building a case. I just didn't know yet who she intended to present it to. The woman standing beside my mother introduced herself as Elaine Porter, a family attorney. She said it casually, as if she were a neighbor stopping by to return a borrowed dish. I didn't invite them inside. What is this about? Elaine looked at my mother, then back at me. Your mother is concerned about the welfare of your children. I almost laughed. My children? Diane folded her arms. Claire, nobody is trying to take your boys away. That is exactly what it sounds like. Elaine opened the folder. We've been discussing the possibility of establishing a more structured arrangement for Mason. Mason was standing behind me. I felt him move closer. An arrangement. A temporary guardianship, Elaine said. The words hit harder than I expected. I looked at my mother. You want custody of Mason? No, Diane said quickly. I want to protect Ethan. There it was again. Always Ethan. Always the same argument. One boy was worth protecting from the other. I stepped toward the doorway. You need to leave. Elaine closed the folder. Claire, I strongly recommend that you don't make an emotional decision. I'm not emotional. I looked directly at my mother. I'm finally paying attention. She stared at me for several seconds. Then she said quietly, you will regret making this harder than it needs to be. They left. I watched their car disappear around the corner. Mason didn't speak until the street was empty. Mom. Yeah. Are they going to take me? I turned around. No. But this time when I said it, I knew I needed more than words. That night I called an attorney of my own. Her name was Rebecca Shaw, and she had handled family cases for people who didn't have much money and didn't know how to fight people who did. I showed her Mason's screenshots. She studied them without interrupting. Then she asked one question. Did you alter any of these? No. Did you ask him to record anyone? No. She nodded. Good. Don't. She looked at the phone again. Keep the originals. Back them up. Don't confront your mother about what's here. Don't threaten her. And don't let Mason know you're building a case around him. Why? Because if your mother is trying to establish that Mason is unstable or that your household is unsafe, anything that looks like coaching could be used against you. My stomach tightened. So what do I do? Document everything. I almost smiled. I've been doing that. Rebecca looked at me. Then you're already ahead. For the next 2 weeks, I documented everything. Every missed pickup. Every message. Every time my mother invited Ethan somewhere but excluded Mason. Every strange question she asked the boys. Every conversation. I didn't realize how much had happened until I put it all in one folder. The pattern was undeniable. But then something happened that I hadn't expected. Mason started pulling away from me. He stopped eating dinner with us. He stopped showing me his drawings. He stopped leaving his bedroom door open. One night, I found him sitting on the floor beside his bed. His phone was in his hand. Mom, can I ask you something? Anything. If Grandma gets custody of Ethan, do I get sent somewhere else? I sat down. No. But what if she wins? She won't. How do you know? I didn't answer quickly enough. Mason looked at me. That's what I thought. Then he said the sentence that terrified me more than anything else. Maybe it would be easier if I just left. I felt my chest tighten. Don't say that. Why? Because you don't get to solve someone else's cruelty by disappearing. He looked away. She said Ethan would be happier. Your brother is not happier without you. You don't know that. I do. How? Because I've watched him look for you every time you're not in the room. Mason's eyes filled. But before I could reach him, Ethan appeared in the doorway. He had been listening. Grandma said Mason is the reason Mom is always tired. Mason looked at him. Ethan's face crumpled. I told her she was wrong. That was the moment I realized Diane wasn't only dividing my sons. She was teaching them to see each other as the problem. And I knew I had to stop it. The next morning I called my mother and told her she was no longer allowed to be alone with either boy. She exploded. You're punishing me because I care. No. I'm protecting my children because you crossed a line. You'll destroy this family. You already tried. She hung up. 3 hours later, I received an email from Elaine. There would be a formal meeting the following Monday. My mother was requesting that I reconsider the current living arrangement. I stared at the screen. Then I noticed something at the bottom. A list of people who had allegedly expressed concerns about my parenting. My mother's name was there. So was Elaine's. So was my sister Melissa's. And then I saw a name that made my hands go numb. Mason's school counselor. I immediately called the school. The counselor sounded confused. I never agreed to support a guardianship request. Then why is your name on the document? There was silence. I don't know. I forwarded the email. She called me back 20 minutes later. Claire, this document contains statements I never made. My heart began pounding. Someone had forged or manipulated information. And suddenly, the situation was bigger than my mother trying to separate two brothers. Someone was building a story about me. A story designed to make me look incapable of protecting my own children. That evening, Mason came into the kitchen holding his phone. I found something else. What? He unlocked the screen. It was an audio recording. My mother's voice. I recognized it immediately. But the recording wasn't from our house. It was from somewhere else. Mason pressed play. For several seconds there was only background noise. Then my mother spoke. If Claire won't give up Mason willingly, we'll make her believe she's doing it for Ethan. My entire body went still. Then another voice answered. Lane. What about the boy? My mother replied. He'll cooperate eventually. Kids always do when you convince them they're the reason everyone is suffering. The recording ended. I looked at Mason. He wasn't crying. He wasn't shaking. He simply said, "That's why I kept everything." And suddenly, the phone that had seemed like a teenager's private world had become the most important evidence in our house. But there was one thing neither of us knew. My mother had already made one mistake. And 3 days later, she would make another one, in front of witnesses. 3 days later, my mother arrived at the family mediation meeting with the confidence of someone who believed the ending had already been written. She brought Elaine. She brought my sister Melissa. She brought a folder thick enough to make me nervous. I brought Rebecca. And I brought the one thing my mother didn't know I had. Mason's phone. The mediator introduced herself and asked everyone to remain calm. My mother nodded sympathetically. I don't want to fight my daughter, she said. I just want what is best for the boys. I almost admired how easily she said it. Then Elaine opened her folder. She talked about Mason's emotional instability, his social difficulties, his possible negative influence on Ethan. She mentioned my long work hours. She mentioned my divorce. She mentioned the fact that I had recently changed my schedule because my mother had stopped helping with childcare. Every weakness had been collected. Every difficult moment had been turned into evidence. Then she slid a document across the table. This is a proposed temporary guardianship arrangement. I looked at it. It named Ethan as remaining in my home, and Mason as being placed temporarily with my mother. My hands went cold. My mother reached across the table. Claire, you don't have to lose both boys. There it was. The same cruelty from the dinner table, dressed up in legal language. I looked at her. You've been planning this from the beginning. She shook her head. No. I've been trying to save Ethan. Rebecca stood. Before we continue, I'd like to submit evidence. Elaine frowned. What evidence? Rebecca placed a flash drive on the table. My mother's expression changed. Just slightly. But I saw it. The mediator opened the file. The first recording played. My mother's voice filled the room. If Claire won't give up Mason willingly, we'll make her believe she's doing it for Ethan. Nobody spoke. Then Elaine's voice. What about the boy? And my mother's answer. He'll cooperate eventually. My sister's face went white. My father, who had been silent until that moment, stared at the table. The mediator paused the recording. Where did this come from? I looked at Mason. He was sitting beside me. It came from my son. My mother suddenly stood. This is ridiculous. He manipulated that recording. Mason finally spoke. I didn't. His voice was quiet, but everyone heard it. My mother stared at him. You've always misunderstood me. Mason shook his head. No. He reached into his backpack. I understood you perfectly. He pulled out a notebook. Inside were dates. Every conversation he remembered. Every invitation Ethan received without him. Every time Grandma told him he was the reason Mom was tired. Every time she asked whether he wanted to live somewhere else. He had written it all down. Not because he wanted revenge. Because he was afraid nobody would believe him. The mediator read several pages. Then she looked at my mother. Mrs. Morgan, did you make these statements? My mother didn't answer. My father finally did. Yes. Everyone turned toward him. He looked at my mother with tears in his eyes. You did. She whispered his name. But he continued. I knew what you were doing. My mother's face changed. You knew. I knew enough. Then he said something I had never expected. Because I've watched you do it before. The room became completely silent. He told us about my mother's younger sister. A girl named Linda. When my mother was 14 and Linda was 16, their parents had decided Linda was too difficult, too emotional, too rebellious, too much trouble. They sent her to live with an aunt in another state. They told everyone it was temporary. It wasn't. Linda never came home. My mother had spent decades pretending it had never happened. Until Mason. My father looked at her. You saw yourself in him. My mother shook her head. No. Yes, he said. You decided that difficult children are easier to love when they're somewhere else. My mother started crying. For a moment I thought she might finally apologize. Instead she looked at Mason. I was trying to protect your brother. Mason answered quietly. You were trying to get rid of me. That sentence ended everything. The mediator dismissed the guardianship request. Rebecca later helped me file the evidence with the appropriate authorities regarding the falsified school statements. My mother lost unsupervised access to the boys. My sister apologized. My father moved out of my mother's house 6 months later. And Mason. He didn't become magically confident overnight. Healing doesn't work that way. But slowly he changed. He left his bedroom door open again. He started drawing. He stopped sleeping with his backpack beside his bed. And one Saturday morning, months after that dinner, I walked into the kitchen and found him making pancakes for Ethan. Ethan was laughing because Mason had somehow burned the first batch. I stood in the doorway watching them. Mason looked up. Mom, don't just stand there. Grab a plate. Smiled. Coming. Later that afternoon, I found the old locked desk drawer open. Inside was the notebook. The pages filled with dates and evidence. But on the last page, Mason had written something new. It said, "I don't have to prove I deserve to stay anymore." I sat there for a long time with tears in my eyes. Because that was the real ending. My mother thought the story was about which boy deserved to be kept. She was wrong. It was never about choosing between my sons. It was about whether I would allow someone else to convince my child that he was disposable. And I wouldn't. Not then. Not now. Not ever.